Tihei mauri ora. Tihei mauri ora te whai au ki te ao mārama. Piki mai rā, kake mai rā, homa i te wai ora ki au e tū te huana te moe a te kuia i te pō. Te pō i raru ai. Papaki tu ana ngātai ki te reinga. Ka pō, ka kua tai mai rā koutou. O tira kua tai mai rā koe e te rangatira. Vincent, hare mai, hare mai, hare mai. Hare mai ki te whare taonga e tū nei runga i tōna papa. Hare mai rā koutou, ngā kanohi, ngā mātu, ngā tūpuna. Hare mai, whakawhaitihia mai nei, i runga i te reo karanga o te nei rā. O tira Vincent e te rangatira hare mai rā. Hare mai rā e te puna kōrero, hare mai rā e te whare wānanga, hare mai rā e te whare kura. Hare mai rā me o mātauranga o pūkenga katoa, ka hora mai nei i roto i tēnei o tātou huihuinga tangata. Tēnei kaupapa whakahira-hira, tēnei kaupapa whakamahara, te hunga kua rehu-rehu ki te pō, arā rātou kua ngaro nei te tirohanga kanohi, i roto i ngā tau te āhuatanga ki ngā pakanga o tua whakare. Urere haere mai. First and foremost, and always to take the opportunity to acknowledge that divinity that brought into being all things seen and unseen, and ask for that same said divinity to bestow bounties and blessings upon Kirikiriroa, Queenie ngā waihono i te pō, and to her royal household, and for that to be extended to each and every one of you who have come out, who have given up your Saturday morning. I know there's lawns to be done. I know there's tomatoes to go in at this time of year, but here you are. You have come not to listen to me, nor to listen to Sunny, but to listen to our guest, Vincent O'Malley. And as you know, many of you will have read his books and followed and watched videos and programs presented with this, our rangatira, who has opened the way for discussions, has opened the way for debate, and has opened the way for many of us who have not had the opportunity through our own lives, through our own education paths, to hear the stories that have been somewhat put to the side over many years and decades, have been bleached, have been hidden from us. The opportunity to hear from Vincent and get some insights into the world he spends a lot of time in. He comes as an expert with regards to local history here with those events, those eruptions that happened here within the Waikato, within our very city, that have shaped our present and will shape our future going forward. Nō reira kāre, hia ke autoro hia tēnei mihi. I don't want to take too long in welcoming you all here, and thank you for supporting this, the first event of the 28th of October week. We're stretching it out to a week, the first event to commemorate the New Zealand land wars. That being said, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Vincent O'Malley.
It's great to see a wonderful turnout for this morning. I know there were some people who tried to get tickets but left it too late, so apologies to them. I'll have to come back and do it again another time. So I'm just going to talk a bit first about how I discovered New Zealand history, how I came to write my two books on the Waikato War. First, The Great War for New Zealand, Waikato 1800 to 2000, which came out in 2016. And then The Invasion of Waikato to Riri, Tainui, which came out last year. And some of the key themes in these works and why it's important to learn about the wars fought here. So first of all, it's in terms of how I came to be researching this stuff, it wasn't an all obvious sort of career path for me. I grew up in a big working class Irish Catholic household in Christchurch. State House kid, the ninth of 9 children. And we were part of the big Irish Catholic community down there. My father worked at Anglican Railway workshops when we still booked trains in this country. And my mother was a cleaner, and I was too. Actually, she was my boss. We worked at the University of Canterbury, and actually I started in the history department. And emptying people's bins was quite a good way, years later when I went back to select lecturers, to find the people who treated their cleaners with decency. I kind of remember them. But anyway, I was the only one from the family who went off in a different direction, who went to university, and not really something I could have imagined as a child. I suppose I was also fortunate to go to university at a time, only just in the late 1980s, when it was still free. And so I didn't have to go with a vocational plan in mind. I could just go and study something that I had a passion for. And I did have a huge passion for history, and I had a really good history teacher at school. But he refused to teach us any New Zealand history. And I remembered asking him about this one day. I said, "Sir, why aren't we learning New Zealand history?" And he said, "Forget it, lad, nothing happened here, it's boring." And so we did the English Civil War, the Russian Revolution, all of that stuff, and I've often said that New Zealanders would know more about Henry VIII's 6 wives than we would about the 3 Articles of Te, because that was kind of what our education system taught us. But I loved history anyway, and so this time when I went to university as a student, of course I enrolled in a whole bunch of European history courses because that was all that I knew. I decided to drop out of something else. I think it was economics after a few weeks, and I was looking for a filler course, and I picked up the Cantor magazine, student magazine, New Zealand History 101. It was a good filler course. I thought, well, it'll be boring, nothing happened here. My history teacher told me that, but I need to enrol in something, and I did that. And I was blown away by that history, and I thought, why didn't I learn this history at school? The notion that it was boring and very dull, it couldn't be further from the truth. It's essential to who we are, really, as a nation. And so many of us have been denied access to that history, those stories, our stories, of who we are, where we've come from. And so, as I said, I studied what I had a passion for, and not really what I thought would get me a job, but I did end up getting a 3-month job offer in Wellington, working for an organisation involved in researching treaty claims, and that was January 1993, and I kind of never left, so I'm still there, what is it now, 32 years later, essentially still working for iwi, working for the Waitangi Tribunal and others involved in the treaty claims process, and increasingly today in other sorts of things like the MACA process that the current government is busily closing down. So I've had that long career in terms of involvement working directly with iwi and for iwi, and that's been a real privilege for me. Point it that way would help. There we go. And so that's how I ended up writing The Great War for New Zealand. Back in about 2006, I was commissioned by the Waitangi Tribunal to write a report on the Waikato War for its Rohe Potai, or King Country Inquiry. I finished that in 2008. It turned into 2 reports. One was 900 pages long and the other was 600 pages. And actually, when I started these, a lot of people thought, well, hasn't that all been done? Didn't Jamie Bellich cover that? But, Jamie did a brilliant work with that, but these were a couple of chapters in books about the New Zealand wars as a whole, and there was so much more in terms of that history that wasn't really his focus, because his focus was more on the military history. And for me, I'm more interested in the social history, the impact of these wars on communities, what happened afterwards. That's also part of the story, and that wasn't really his focus. So I found a whole lot of aspects of this history that I was amazed by, and I thought if I didn't know this before, probably most people wouldn't either. And one of the things I think about the claims process is it's often iwi talking to the Crown, talking to the government, and other New Zealanders aren't part of the conversation. Often they've got no idea of the history behind the claims because they weren't taught it at school. And so people don't have the historical context in order to understand these things. And so they don't understand, for example, that when an iwi signs a treaty settlement, typically that's worth about 1% of the value of what was lost. So people who think Māori are getting rich with treaty claims, they're not. Essentially, 99% of what you lost is signed away through a treaty settlement, so it's a huge sacrifice. People don't understand basic things like that. So we launched the Great War for New Zealand at Te Whare Taonga Pukai in Huntly on the 8th of October 2016, and it was a huge honour for me to present the first official copy to King Tuheitia, and that was a massive occasion, and it was really important for me that the book was presented to Tainui first of all, and there was a wonderful reception to that as well, which was very humbling for me. And so that's followed, as I said, by the little brother to that, The Invasion of Waikato Te Riri ki Tainui, came out last year, and the idea behind that is a shorter, more accessible introduction to the history, because I talked about my two reports were 1,500 pages. My big book, The Great War for New Zealand, is 700 pages. It's a pretty substantial beast. It weighs 2.5 kilos, people have told me, and you need to do some weight training to pick it up. So if you want the lighter version, this is it. But I tried to do more than just a summary of the big book. There's some new material in here on things like the fate of the battle sites. What happened to Aotearoa after 1864? Because to me, that's a bit of a metaphor for the history. And one of the ways that we've marked these sites, and when I say we here, I'm essentially talking to Pākehā, New Zealand. We destroy the pā and we run a road through the middle of them, and often we name them after the commander who invaded the district, and that's how these sites have been commemorated. And that to me speaks volumes about how we've kind of engaged with this history. And so as I say, looking at what happened to those sites afterwards, and also that little book has got profiles with a range of artists, teachers, tribal historians, academics and others who've helped to promote awareness of that history as well. So moving on to the Waikato War itself. So in the early hours of the 12th of July 1863, Lieutenant General Duncan Cameron led 380 troops across the Mangatawhiri River that marked the boundary between the Kingitanga and Crown areas of control. And so this was the beginning of the invasion of Waikato. And it was a conflict that spanned more than 9 months. It ended at Aotearoa on the 2nd of April 1864, and it involved as many as 12,000 British Imperial troops and naval units, along with several thousand colonial forces as well. Interesting thing about the British Army, those 12,000 troops, some work done by Professor Charlotte MacDonald shows that around 2/3 of the rank and file were actually Irish. And as somebody of Irish ancestry myself, I've often wondered, what did they think about fighting a war of conquest for the very same crown that had dispossessed them and their people? Did they see those parallels? And the short answer to that is a lot of those men were illiterate, so that there's not huge numbers of letters and journals and diaries recounting their thoughts and experiences of that. But there is enough evidence to suggest that they did become increasingly disillusioned with what they were being asked to do, and you know that their kind of view was, why should we be doing the dirty work for settlers in New Zealand? Why aren't they doing it for themselves? Because they saw it as essentially a land grab on behalf of settlers in New Zealand. So those are the Crown forces. In total, the Kingitanga could call on around 4,000 defenders in total, not all at one time, but over the course of that war. The majority from Waikato and Ngāti Maniapoto, but including contingents from just about every other iwi across the North Island. And at the end of the fighting, survivors retreated south across the Puniu River, and Crown forces seized and occupied 1.2 million acres of very valuable land north of there. So essentially all of Waikato up to Auckland is confiscated, and that's a hugely valuable resource that is taken from those iwi. And the Waikato War, I think, is something that all New Zealanders should know something about, because it had a profound influence on New Zealand as a whole. And this isn't a small regional story, but one of national and even international significance given the number of British troops involved. So at one point there were more British troops in New Zealand than there were anywhere else in the British Empire outside of India. So it is a significant conflict in terms of imperial history as well. And so in 1865, Wiremu Tanihana wrote that when it came to the time of the murder at Rangiawhia, then I knew for the first time that this was a great war for New Zealand. And Wiremu Tanihana's statement provided the title for my book, The Great War for New Zealand. And that was the first book-length overview of the Waikato War to be published since 1879. As I say, there have been lots of coverage in terms of chapters in books about the New Zealand Wars as a whole, but in terms of an overview of that conflict as a whole, the last one that I'm aware of is John Featon in 1879. And for a conflict that had a profound influence on the shape and course of subsequent New Zealand history, I'd suggest as a nation it seems to have gone to considerable lengths to forget this war, forget that it ever happened. So Wiremu Tamihana's statement really sums up my big book's central argument, which is that the defining conflict in New Zealand history didn't take place on the Western Front or at Gallipoli or North Africa or anywhere else. Instead, it took place right here. And it's a history, as I say, that many Pākehā preferred to ignore over the years, but Tainui have never been able to forget this history. And one thing I often say is that a mature nation takes ownership of its history, not just cherry-picking out the good bits to remember, but also acknowledging the bad stuff as well. And the Waikato War featured some of the darkest episodes in New Zealand history. It was a deliberate war of conquest started by the Crown, relying on fabricated evidence of a supposed kingitanga threat to Europeans. And it saw a professional standing army belonging to the world's sole superpower at the time unleashed on a civilian population that was hugely outnumbered and didn't have the firepower and technology that was available to the British. In this asymmetrical war, the British had armour-plated steamers and Māori had wooden canoes, and were outnumbered 3 or 4 to 1. So really it should have been no contest. And under these circumstances, the Tainui tribes and their supporters suffered horrendous casualty rates that were in all likelihood even higher on a per capita basis than those suffered by New Zealand troops during World War I. And that was one of the things I worked out when I was doing this research for the Tribunal years ago. Looked at relative casualty rates, and I took the most conservative figures I could reasonably adopt, and they were still double the casualty rate suffered by New Zealand troops during World War I, which is supposed to be the greatest bloodbath in New Zealand history. And those killed included women and children, some the victims of clear atrocities. At Rangiawhia in February 1864, people were deliberately tortured to death inside their whares. And Rangiawhia was supposed to be a place of sanctuary for women, children and elderly men. It wasn't a pa, it was an open village. And the men were waiting for the British at Patarangi for a battle that took place. So what happened at Rangiawhia is not a battle, it's really, it's a series of atrocities where people who were not combatants are attacked and killed. At Orako, the final battle of the conflict, 320 people inside that pa, and over half of them are killed, most not during the 3-day siege, but on the final day when they're literally running for their lives to the safety of the Punia River on foot, and they're hunted down by cavalry, and large numbers are killed, including documented cases of female prisoners bayoneted by troops in cold blood. So there's a lot of myth-making about this chivalrous and noble conflict, but the reality is much darker. There wasn't anything noble and glorious about any of this, and really it's about acknowledging that fact as well, even though that might be uncomfortable history for some. And I think owning our past requires guts and maturity, but it's an essential step in the development of the nation. And I say in my big book, if we look closely enough, we can even find some uplifting aspects of the story, such as the principled idealism and bicultural vision of Wiremu Tamihana, who's a really remarkable figure. You know, if you don't know about Wiremu Tamihana, you're missing out a very rich story about an inspirational man. Riri Maniapoto, often denigrated by Europeans in the 19th century, but he insisted on fighting fairly and honourably, even when under a horrendous attack. And another sort of, I think to me, uplifting aspect of this history is the sheer bravery of those few Pākehā who spoke out against the war at a time when most settlers were baying for Māori blood. That took real courage and conviction to go against the grain in the way that they did, to speak justice to power in that way. And I think Pākehā who lack awareness of this history also lack the means to fully understand the present. Māori poverty, for example, makes little sense without an understanding of the historical context, leaving some to resort to what's known as deficit theories, essentially blaming Māori themselves for their current predicament. In reality, the invasion of Waikato destroyed a flourishing Māori economy, and that was followed by sweeping and indiscriminate land confiscations that pushed generations of Tainui people into landlessness and poverty. And it also marks the point at which the Treaty of Waitangi is essentially swept aside for the next century or more, and that's felt in multiple ways. So the war ends in 1864. In 1865, the Native Land Court is established. That was famously described by Sir Hugh Kafaru as an engine of destruction for Māori society. And that strips Māori of their lands. 2 years later, you got a native school system that strips Māori of their language. And so, you know, this is an ancient history. It's really the story of how we got to where we are today. And so those effects can be felt in multiple ways, whether it's in socioeconomic statistics or in the perilous state of te reo Māori. And yet, this is the thing, for all of Governor Gray's and George Cameron's efforts, the kingitanga wasn't actually destroyed in the Waikato War, but it endures and even thrives to this day. And that actually wasn't in the Crown's plan in 1863. And so, while we remember this as a time of great pain and suffering, we should also acknowledge the fact that mere survival and endurance in these circumstances was a considerable feat in its own right. Actually, somebody said to me when my book came out in 2016 that they read it as a survival narrative. We're still here. Despite everything, we're still here. And so that's another way of looking at it. But that big book also sought to set to rest a few old myths. And one of them, when Governor Gray was assembling what I call his dodgy dossier of supposed evidence justifying the unjustifiable, his invasion of Waikato in 1863, he claimed that Tainui were intent on attacking the settlers. And you still hear that line parroted by a few people today. My book shows that this supposed plot to massacre the settlers was a total fabrication used to justify a predetermined war of conquest and invasion. So Auckland was a key market for Tainui produce, and it would have been rather suicidal to destroy that market. Riri Maniapoto, the supposed ringleader of this imminent attack on Auckland, was actually in Taupo at the time that the war began. So he was in the wrong place to be attacking Auckland. He'd gone south rather than north. The evidence just simply does not stack up at all. And that's why after the war, Woodward Tabihana's pleas for an independent inquiry into who'd been responsible for the war are never granted, because the government knew that any truly independent investigation would reveal that the Crown had been responsible for this war, that it was a premeditated war of conquest and invasion, and that truth had to be hidden and suppressed. I suggest without conflict, without dialogue rather, there can be no reconciliation. As a nation, we need to have a conversation about the wars fought here, and the purpose of remembering them isn't to sow discord or division, but actually to bind us together as a nation that can openly and honestly confront our past, and we can talk about it. That's not about assigning blame, it's just about taking ownership of our history, and moving confidently into the future, I think, requires a robust understanding of where we've come from. So we commemorate World War I on a grand scale because it provides really opportunities to rally around the flag. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but I think the wars fought here, they're also part of our story. We also need to remember them and to commemorate those who fell in those conflicts. The Waikato War offers cold comfort for those seeking reassuring tales of patriotism. And some have argued it's best to let sleeping dogs lie, but I beg to differ on that. I think these are stories that need to be told and heard if our nation is to move forward together. There's a lovely quote from the Waitangi Tribunal where they said in one of their reports, while only one side remembers the suffering of the past, dialogue will always be difficult. One side commences the dialogue with anger and the other side has no idea why. Reconciliation cannot be achieved by this means. But this is our story, our history. It happened here in this place relatively recently in historical terms, and it had profound consequences for what New Zealand was and what it would become. And so we need to own this history, and if we did, we'd learn a lot of surprising things. And one of them would be just how dependent the settlers of Auckland were on Tainui in the pre-war period. To feed them, to build their homes, to defend them from supposedly hostile iwi. So in 1845, the government even built a cottage for Potato Te Whewhiwhi, the future Māori king, at Pukekawa, right next to where Auckland Museum now stands in the Auckland Domain. And that was during the Northern War fought against Haneheke and Kawati. And there were rumours that Haneheke was going to attack the settlement of Auckland and massacre the residents. And Te Whewhiwhi personally pledged to defend the people of Auckland from attack. So what he did was he declared Auckland the hem of his cloak, which made it part of his personal tapu. And really there could be no greater protection for Auckland than that. And the cottage was recognition of just how reliant the settlers were on Tainui and other iwi in so many different ways. And so I think this is a history a lot of people probably don't really have an awareness of. The enormous contribution that Tainui and other iwi made to the development of Auckland was recognised and understood at the time though. In the 1840s, one Auckland newspaper said that European residents would have been literally starved out of the country if it weren't for the produce that Māori brought to them from Waikato and elsewhere every week. And it wasn't just Te Whare vowing to defend the people of Auckland either. Hundreds of Tainui people moved to Mangere and elsewhere on the outskirts of Auckland to protect the settlers. But as Pākehā numbers grew through the 1850s, the relationship starts to change quite a bit, and even great rangatira began reporting being abused and harassed by settlers, who also had their eyes on the rich natural grasslands of the Waikato district. So at this time the dynamics are changing and a war for the future of New Zealand lays ahead. And at its heart it suggests there's two competing visions, a Māori one premised on mutual prosperity and partnership, on the other hand Pākehā expectations of unbridled power and racial dominance. So the Treaty of Waitangi, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, is signed in 1840, but contrary to popular myth, New Zealand isn't magically transformed into a colony ruled from the centre overnight. On the ground, in many places, law changes, and iwi like Tainui continue to manage their own affairs as they always had. But what the treaty did do is introduce a new player to the local scene in the form of the Crown, as well as signalling the start of a period of mass British migration to New Zealand that results in Māori being outnumbered by 1858. And a lot of those new settlers weren't willing to play second fiddle to a bunch of so-called natives. So the seeds of disharmony are there from the start, especially as Māori continue to assert their rangatira and settlers demand self-rule and unimpeded access to Māori lands. And so what happens is in 1852, a new constitution grants Pākehā their own parliament, but effectively Māori are denied the right to participate in this new forum because there's a property qualification based on European forms of land tenure. And so you get a settler government established that's overwhelmingly hostile to Māori interests. The ironic thing is it didn't need to be this way because the 1852 constitution also included a clause called Section 71 that provided for native districts to be declared in which the right of Māori to manage their own affairs would be formally recognised by the Crown. And so, you know, what could have happened is Waikato is proclaimed under Section 71 of the Constitution Act, the right of Tainui to manage their own affairs is recognised legally. And so that's providing a de jure recognition of the de facto situation that then's on the ground. But that never happens because people like George Gray aren't interested in a sort of relationship of equals with Tainui and with rangatira. And so you get this hostile parliament established, Māori are excluded from it. There's still the majority of the population in the early 1850s, but they're excluded from the parliamentary system until much later, until 1868. One of the ways that Māori respond to this and other concerns such as ongoing land loss is to look for new ways to unite as Māori. And the kingitanga that saw Potatau Te Whare raised up as the first king in 1858 is one response. And Wiremu Tamihana described Queen Victoria as a fence for us all, Māori and Pākehā. And he denies that the kingitanga was seen as a challenge to the Crown's authority. In fact, Tainui believed that they had a very warm relationship with Queen Victoria because they viewed the treaty as very much establishing a personal bond with the British royal family. Her emissaries has entered into that agreement, and she was a great rangatira, and rangatira were people of honour, they were people of their word. And if she said that would be respected, then they trusted her to do that. And so an interesting aspect of this is you get a whole group of delegations that travel to England seeking an audience with Queen Victoria so that she would personally intercede on their behalf, because she had told various rangatira who had travelled to England she loved her Māori people, she would do anything for them. She's a great rangatira. They thought if only she knew what was happening to her beloved Māori people on the other side of the world, she would intervene to bring justice to that situation. So King Tāwhia goes there in 1884 and he's denied an audience by the New Zealand government representative in London because again they didn't want the truth of this history to get out. So the kingitanga is not, it's an institution that's established for Māori, it's not against Pākehā. But that's not how the Crown comes to see it. They view it as a hostile institution that can't be allowed to stand, and that paves the way for the invasion of Waikato in July 1863. And the war that followed has devastating and profound consequences for all those on the receiving ends of British bullets. So just wrapping up a little bit now, and some of the new things that I found that I talked about earlier. One, I've already mentioned the casualty rates. Another thing, the ultimatum issued to the Tainui tribe. So the invasion begins on the 12th of July 1863. One day before, on the 11th of July, there's an ultimatum that's issued that says British troops are about to move into the Waikato, lay down your arms and take an oath of allegiance to Queen Victoria. Your lives and your lands will be spared if you do. And that's a fairly important document because it's giving the iwi an opportunity to comply with the Crown's demands. The only problem with that is I found a draft of this dated the 13th of July, so one day after the invasion began. So the reality is that they weren't being given an opportunity to comply with those terms. This was just window dressing by Governor Grey to make it look like a just war, to make it look like they'd been given the chance to comply. They hadn't at all. And, you know, Grey had come to New Zealand with this reputation as a great humanitarian. He's trying to preserve that legacy and that reputation by making it appear that this was a war that he'd entered into very, very reluctantly. But that's not the case at all. The socioeconomic consequences of the war. So what happens to the Tainui survivors after they retreat south of the Tainui River in April 1864? What happens is all of their lands north of the Tainui River have been confiscated. The population of what becomes known as the King Country, because King Tawhia lives here after 1864, population of that district doubles overnight, but the resources available to support that population have shrunk dramatically because of the raupatu. And you get reports of people actually dying of starvation in the first few years after 1864. There's enormous hardship. And that was something, again, that I was amazed when I read some of those accounts, because you don't think of people starving to death in New Zealand, but that happened here in the 1860s. Confiscation, raupatu, all of those things. So the Waikato War, as I said, had a major influence on the shape and direction of New Zealand history. More British troops in New Zealand than anywhere else in the British Empire outside of India for a time in the 1860s. It marks the point at which the North Island and Auckland starts to become dominant over the South. That takes a long time to play out. It takes decades to play out, but it wouldn't have happened without the Crown's invasion of Waikato in the 1860s. It marks the start of a century-long period when fertility is thrown out the window, essentially. Sweeping and indiscriminate land confiscations pushed generations of Tainui people into low system poverty. And this history of internal conflict, as I said, I think makes some people uncomfortable because it's seen as a source of division compared with Anzac Day. But it doesn't need to be that way. I think, as I said, a mature nation needs to own its history, warts and all. And it's not about assigning blame, just about taking ownership of our history, being mature about it. And understanding mutual respect and dialogue will bring us together, not tear us apart. It's actually about reconciliation, not recrimination. And that doesn't require guilt or shame, just honesty and a willingness to confront these difficult topics. And actually that's where young people have been leading the way on this. So many of you will know about the Aotearoa College petition. In 2014, a group of students, some as young as 14 from Aotearoa, visited Orako and Rangiawhia, 20 minutes or so from their school. And they were shocked to learn what had happened at these places, because they weren't learning this history at school like me. They went back to class and said, what can we do about this? And what they did was organise a petition. They got 12,000 signatures, most not electronically, that just face-to-face, convincing people why it was important to engage with this history. And the petition was presented to Parliament in 2015. It called for a National Day of Commemoration for all victims of New Zealand wars, Māori and Pākehā, and also for the history of these conflicts to be taught in all schools. And in 2016, the government announced a day of commemoration would be held. Te Puutake o Te Riri, He Raa Maumahara, which of course is next Tuesday, the 28th of October. 2019, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern announced that New Zealand history would be taught in all schools from 2023. Although at the moment we're seeing proposals to rebalance a curriculum, whatever that means. To me it seems watering it down quite significantly, and I understand there's going to be an announcement about that on Tuesday, and I'm not looking forward to it. But teaching New Zealand history in all schools, I think, is a crucial step in ensuring future generations leave school with at least some level of understanding of our nation's past, including the good, the bad and the ugly, as Rahui Papa said at the time. And it also opens up important discussions around how this is taught. for me, the really important thing is that students should engage with the whenua they live on, they go to school on. They should know about the places they call home. That's really important. It gives you a sense of grounding and identity to know that. And actually, young people are not, they don't hide from this history. They want to learn it, just like those students at Waikato College. And so that, I think, is really important. And obviously it's important that iwi and hapu are at the forefront of that process as well. And I just wanted to close by talking about, I talked about my own schooling experience, not learning in New Zealand history. And I was giving a talk about this years ago. Actually, it was quite an important occasion because it was the New Zealand History Teachers Association conference here in Hamilton in 2018. And it was at that conference that the history teachers passed a resolution supporting mandatory teaching of New Zealand history in all schools. So the fact that they got behind it was hugely important. Anyway, I gave the anecdote about not learning New Zealand history. And at the end of that, somebody came up to me afterwards and said, "Hi, do you remember me?" I was like, "Oh, you look familiar." He said, "Well, I'm your old history teacher." Well, that's quite awkward, isn't it? But it was a good thing I said he was a good history teacher. But anyway, he told me that later on he'd moved to an area where most of the students in his classrooms were Māori. And one day he thought, why am I teaching Tudor and Stuart history to a room full of Māori? So he went off and learnt some New Zealand history himself, probably for the first time, and he was blown away by that. And he'd become a huge convert. So he was the last person I expect to see at a conference of people teaching New Zealand history, but he had, because he, in many respects, like me, was a victim of the very same education system that taught us New Zealand history was boring. Well, the alternative to that was we got the rose-tinted version, greatest race relations in the world and all that kind of stuff. And so it's all about breaking that intergenerational cycle of ignorance about our past and just being upfront and honest about it. And so, in the end, despite that initial awkwardness, that was really encouraging for me to hear from him that he had done that. And we're all on that journey together in many respects. So I'll wrap up there, and I think we've got a bit of time for any questions, Pātai, if anybody's got any. Thank you.